So now a few notes about Hadrian's background, what I'll call the Ernest Hemingway version. He's an independent practitioner that designs and builds buildings, makes art, writes, and curates exhibitions. He was the former undergraduate director at USC and teaches in the undergrad and grad program, and previously that other place across town with the blue cursive script logo. He was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, received his Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from the University of New Mexico, and his graduate degree in Master of Architecture from Harvard GSD. His architectural practice, Hadrian Predock Art and Architecture, was founded in 2015 after a 15-year collaboration with John Frame when the firm was known as Predock Frame Architects. Like Frederick Kiesler, Joseph Elbers, Donald Judd, and others, Hadrian's current practice is a multidisciplinary one that moves with dexterity across various media and scales, ranging from small-scale art projects to large public venues. The work is notable not only for the contents, but also for the aspiration to challenge the conventional boundaries of architectural practice. His professional accolades include the 2004, 2012 Venice Biennale, 2006 Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial, Architectural League Emerging Voices, multiple AIA honors, and has exhibited its work internationally at MoCA, Venice Biennale, Pomona College Museum of Art, Boston IDCA, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Cooper Hewitt Museum. As an artist, Predock works on the interchange between art and architecture. His art practice serves to illuminate questions surrounding architecture from outside of the medium and discipline, generating new understandings and liveliness through art making, engaging the periphery of what helps to constitute architecture and architecture practices. Predock works with painting, objects, and environments to reveal and enhance the more peripheral subjects of architecture. Please welcome Hadrian Predock.
Thanks, Gary. Let's try and get the Fritz in here to resolve itself. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Gary. You covered a bunch of stuff I was supposed to say, like this introduction, so I guess I'm going to make stuff up now. Thank you so much. A few just thanks to the broader field. Like again, like thanks to Gary for organizing all this. Thanks to Keiko for all of her extraordinary work on communications and getting the word out and keeping all this kind of linked into the network of all the different USC events and exhibitions. Thank you, John and Antonio back there for helping with the exhibition installation and all of your team. Thank you, Alicia and Deepak, for all of your help technically. And of course to Dean Brett Steele, who supports this series, which will kind of keep going. It's been here for a long time, and I'm glad to be back with this again. Okay, so this lecture and exhibition, the exhibition obviously over there, is focused on a single project, which is the Mountain House, and how it's really about how that project becomes a speculative other form of itself, which is a workforce housing project that is designed for mountain communities. So we'll talk about that in the lecture itself. And both of them are based on the title Long House is related to the Longhouse, which is a kind of type in architecture, but also for a particular kind of pre-modern building that I'm also going to kind of touch on. And also this kind of relationship to this other model, which is the mountain hut. So the lecture is going to be focused around all that. But before I do all that, I wanted to, there are many students out here in the audience who are probably less familiar with my work, so I'm going to bombard you with like 100 images here that give you a sense of what my practice is like before I get into the lecture content. Gary went through a bunch of stuff already on this list, so I'm trying not to be too repetitive. So I was born in New Mexico. I was there for 20 years. I've lived in LA for about 30 years and practiced for about 25 of those. I had a 15, 16-year practice with John Frame. So a lot of this work that you're seeing here would have been a collaboration between John and I during particular times. The work, as you can see, ranges from all the kinds of things that Gary was talking about, from small-scale installations to medium-sized projects, residential, to larger kind of cultural projects, and much in between. And Gary put it much better than I will, but I really see myself as a hybrid practitioner, visual artist, architect, and of course, educator, which I have also been doing since pretty much grad school. And one thing that's been always really important to me is how, like, I came out of a background where visual arts and architecture were kind of intertwined. My mom is a dancer, my father was an architect, and there was a lot of kind of interchange between those worlds. I grew up amongst that, so I see the kind of boundaries between art and architecture as being quite fluid and having a quite rich interchange between them. And that underlies a lot of the work that you're looking at. A building may, a painting may inform a building, an installation may be a kind of experiment in certain ways of working that inform the architectural. And then the current art practice that is more kind of like focused around painting right now, which has ranged from installation to other kind of forms, really is kind of working on the systems of representation that Gary was talking about. And teacher representation course here, there's one of them, that really kind of dives into my interest in forms of visual representation and how those are kind of drivers or motives that can produce design and not just be kind of after effects. So this is going to kind of wrap up in a second. So the Long House exhibition and today's talk relate primarily and deeply to my experiences growing up in New Mexico and Colorado, time that many times that I have spent in the mountains, at camps, camping, hiking, skiing, being in the mountains. It's something that is still very much active in my life. And it also relates to my current interests in housing. I'm teaching a housing studio. I coordinate the grad second year housing studio. And in that studio, we're working, I would say, fairly experimentally with questions of what housing is or might be. And we kind of focus the studio around what is housing now. And it gets very much into a lot of the kind of questions around individual and collective, codes about housing, kind of new emerging forms of housing, different kinds of housing. So as soon as we get this, so jump right in. Did it go through all the slides? I wasn't paying attention.
Very cerebral.
Okay, there we go. Awesome. All right. Okay, so the Long House. And again, I see this as two projects. There's a lot of kind of rhetorical stuff going on here. Have fun with it, I guess. So one of the kind of long houses is real and built, and the other is very much speculative, but I believe totally buildable, and one that I'm kind of actively kind of trying to promote with a number of people that I'm talking to right now. The houses are simultaneously what I'm calling a long-ish house. In the mountains, it functions more like a flexible kind of mountain hut. And this more speculative, or what I'm calling a longer house, that may function as a new form of mountain town workforce co-living. So the build project, which I'm going to show first, which is the over there, what I'm calling the Longish House, is at 9,200 feet in the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. I'll show you that in a second. It's approximately 16 feet wide by 96 feet long, so for me it's kind of just entering into this kind of territory of the long house. It's the arrows pointing at. It's a pretty modest house in terms of square footage. It's around 1,700 square feet. And I'm going to talk a lot about this kind of flexible nature of the house and the flexible forms of programming. So it can accommodate, really like 1 to 10 people square footage in different forms. It's obviously a house, as you see it, that's really driven by economies of scale, form, and structure. It needs to deal with really harsh weather conditions. It is completely off the grid, so it's basically solar, septic, propane, the kind of things that you can find on. So the longer house, as it's being named, is the more kind of speculative model. It's the one on the bottom. And this one uses the top house, the longish house, as a kind of basis for exploring forms of linear collective co-living, or what we might call mountain workforce housing. There's a really major economic housing problem that is associated with these mountain towns, especially ski towns, where basic housing is really out of reach for many folks that are adjacent to these locations, who support all kinds of forms of necessary labor to support those towns and cities. So the longer house, as we look at it dimensionally, is closer to 200 feet long, and it's proposed as a kind of counter model to the detached, deed-restricted homes that are more common as a kind of solution for this workforce housing that I'll talk about later on in the production. And these are both really informed by a kind of deeper typological interest in the longhouse, as it's been really kind of worked on as a research project through practices like dogma, which I'll show, and the mountain hut as another kind of model, example model, and kind of drawing for both of these in terms of how I think about both the longish house and the longer house. So the long house has a really rich and deep history as what I would describe as a very legible and linear communal housing model. You can find it in many different cultures across the globe. While the mountain hut presents kind of a flexible and more temporary form of collective living. So I want to talk about each of these a little bit before I dive into houses themselves. I'll start with the long house. So I'm obviously leveraging like a whole bunch of like really deep kind of expansive research around the long house that is primarily investigated by Morelli and Dogma and others. I spent a great deal of time kind of looking at this. I have not. So for me, it's more of a kind of preference, and I want to make sure I kind of credit like research I've done. So this is an example in this drawing of one of the long houses that Dogma looked at in their research, both in their exhibition and lectures that have focused on this type. And there's a lecture that Pierre Vittorio gives. It's a really fantastic lecture. Somebody's seen that up there. You should watch it. It's amazing. Really kind of like gets into a kind of like thesis around the long house and very deep understanding. Very much recommend. So I really like this Dogma got interest in these kind of long houses. I've had a kind of interest in like these longer linear types that we especially find kind of like scattered throughout the West, whether it is a kind of single-wide the landscape, but something that's been very kind of vernacular and dated to the landscapes that I'm familiar with and grew up with in New Mexico and Colorado. So there's kind of like loose relationship there. Anyways, in any case, like I developed a kind of obsession around these types. What Dogma really focuses on is mostly a kind of pre-modern form of communal living. There are some examples that are still inhabited. And they're really buildings that are formed from an entire village. You can think about a village fitting into one building, and that the building itself is the village. It's a linear communal typology where space is shared and assigned in certain ways, often in four quarters. It's a kind of family kinship community under one roof. And these are pretty amazing buildings in the sense that they can be up to 450 feet and longer. They're quite impressive in terms of their scale and their kind of robustness. This is a longhouse that would have been in the And here you can see a kind of typical plan. I think that's a plan maybe from the same project. That shows these kind of regulated internal orders that expand and contract based on familiar plans. It's a very expandable, flexible building without architects, as Dr. would say, because the inhabitants themselves are the builders. There's also no real kind of concept of ownership in the longhouse. That is like something that we kind of constructed in our own sets of ownership logics. And certainly transcends differences between what we describe as private and public, and definitely complicates distinctions between public and private and collective. This is Anisaga longhouse, related to the Gogadala people in Papua New Guinea. So formally, I'm not going to show many of these, but you can imagine, if you get interested, just check them out, because there are lots of different kind of like formal versions and styles. They come in many different kind of shapes and sections, and you can find them in different kind of geographic locations. Many, unfortunately, are gone. Those that are kind of remaining tend to be kind of tourist sites to show you what the longhouse might be like. And there are, kind of a few left, and they're more like this. They're more of this kind of like more salvaged kind of scrap material versus the kind of consistency of material you would have seen in the kind of pre-modern versions. Again, very legible, very robust, expandable, flexible. It's a super persistent type, I think, architectural kind of interdisciplinary way, and one that is totally linked to this kind of flattening of individual and collective binaries. In other words, like there is no distinction between individual and collective here. This is the interior of the longhouse in Borneo. Pronouncing this correctly. And this is really a way of living that challenges all sorts of modern assumptions about domestic space and property relations. So in Dogma's research, they're really kind of looking at the longhouse and trying to develop a certain kind of way of utilizing and thinking about it. So there are these kind of theses that are developed. I won't go into all of them. There's something like 7 or 8 developed. But to give you an example, Pierre Vittorio Borelli uses the term communal instead of collective, because collective is always in association with an individual. So it sets up a kind of binary. So here it wants to kind of erase that. And that the longhouse itself erases that because it never existed in the first place. And he establishes also that live and work and the sacred and the profane are always kind of coexistent in the longhouse. And that the part is always understood in relation to the whole. This is a kind of so now to kind of go into the mountain a bit, I would guess that there's probably a series of research projects around the mountain. If anybody knows about one, let me know because I'm interested in them. This is just kind of my interpolations about how I understand it. So the mountain hut really is, again, a form of temporary collective cohabitation that is generally accessed through a journey on foot or by skis, bikes, etc., kind of resistant to these more modern forms of transportation, and takes you to a kind of different set of worlds that are based on others. So the mountain hut also challenges conventional forms of housing, I would say. If we kind of look at it as a form of housing, which I like too. We might think of it as a social condenser, as a very kind of unstable type with a high degree of flexibility. They're often part of a network of hut-to-hut stops along a kind of greater journey. Some of you may have been on hut-to-hut hikes. They actually do exist in our country too. They're not just kind of elsewhere, which are here. They're not as kind of formalized. And what I really love about them is that they're part of a kind of network, part of a kind of larger kind of system of collectivity, but each hut tends to have a really distinct kind of personality associated with it. We look at the communal space, and this is where we kind of get into like some of the kind of interests in housing and where housing is kind of moving right now, where communal space is more maximized and shared instead of having a bunch of kind of individuated units where there isn't sharing, there's not co-housing, there's not co-living. This is very much a co-living situation, albeit a temporary one. And the mountain hut in particular is a place that establishes social interaction with spaces for strangers that share, let's say, particular passions, right? To commingle with each other and also to commingle with hosts. So while the sleeping space is condensed and minimized, often in shared circumstances, like I'm showing in this image, like this is really condensed, right? This is kind of screen end of the spectrum, and this is really obviously for being for a night, so living there. But I think this kind of relationship between maximized collective and shared space and kind of minimizing, like condensing dwelling or sleeping space, I think is something that is important to learn in these types. There's also, obviously, in mountain huts, these more kind of discrete spaces for separation and privacy. That's really what you want, but in doing such, the privacy here is really kind of like minimized, right? This room is probably like 6 or 7 feet wide. I'm not getting into the limits of our codes, right? Spaces like this in this country. But I think this is where some of the inherent economics really kind of come into play and how we kind of be informed by these ideas when working on other kinds of projects. Okay, so we get right into the Longish house, and this is the one that's built, and clearly, hopefully, informed by both of these kind of types of looking at. So, at face value, it is a house in the mountains, but it's one that I hope we'll start to see that's really starting to be like a mountain hut, and like a longhouse in certain ways, kind of resisting certain things about a house or its houses. It's very recently finished, last fall, not formally photographed yet. These are all kind of like iPhone pics, so look at them with a grain of salt. Kind of like them for that reason, I guess. It is another kind of like gable form house. We're seeing a kind of proliferation of these, like kind of history of architecture, very driven by economics. So what you work on here, I think, is a kind of exploiting of a range of very kind of tight conceptual ideas within that archetype, which I'll talk about. I think that's kind of how you work on something like this. I mean, you can think about the soils, they're very challenging, these are super expansive soils. It has particular kind of like foundation systems it has to sit on, so it's all about kind of developing economies of repetition, right, that extend into the windows, the siding, the materials, all of that. So as I said, the house is in the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado at 9,200 feet, so it's pretty far up there. If any of you've been to the San Juan Mountains, you will know them well. They're quite amazing to climb. And a lot of folks refer to them as like the Switzerland of the Rockies, Swiss because of the dramatic condition of the mountains. So we get all kinds of like, say, seasonal changes, very isolated location, inclement weather, and sometimes to get to this house, you have to access it by snowshoes, just because that's the way it is. So for me, in designing this project, I always wanted a very kind of legible graphic marker in the landscape versus trying to compete with the landscape normally, which I think is impossible. So that's what was another kind of thing that was really like driving the project. Get a taste of it during the cycle through winter. It really kind of changes very dramatically from season to season. And things like snow on the roof also kind of modify the house itself, which wasn't something I thought about, but like it's cool because it kind of erases that gradient differences. So to get into some of the kind of organization around the house, so obviously kind of looking at this linear typology of architecture that may have some kind of references to the longhouse itself. What I think is cool about this type is that, for one, it allows daylight to enter either side of the house into every space in the house. And then when you're on the ends of that linear model, you get like 3 different sides, and you have associated with that as well. So there's that kind of like, you know, central long axis, right? And you might think of that as a kind of continuous volume that then has these other spaces in it that are involved with panels that are sliding and swinging that can modify its relationship to that larger volume to create degrees of privacy or porosity. Then there's this kind of smaller grain, which is the lateral grain, which we talk about more. And there's that kind of interaction between like the lateral grain of the house, like how that direction, the smaller kind of axis, interacts with the long axis that produces other things that happen in the house, which I'll talk about in a second. So the house, we start to kind of get a sense of like the site here, and a little taste of the Central Mountains. The house is oriented towards really incredible mountain views on two sides, and then towards more of a kind of forest or glade of aspens on the other two sides. It has what I would call a more kind of extroverted side that extends towards this kind of deeper views where the windows frame these kind of fragments of mountain views. That's my wife's side. She's more of the extroverted family. And then there's a more introspective side that is bounded by an aspen grove. Maybe that's a little more unique. So then there's this slide that also keeps kind of going through the exhibition as well. It really kind of talks about these different like conceptual motives in the house. Tom kind of working in these particular kind of economies and ways of thinking about design within the linear roof form, kind of working in the kind of archetype itself. Then also trying to kind of relate some of those qualities back to the longhouse and the mountain hut in certain ways. So there are these four different kind of approaches, let's say, that are really hopefully kind of like obviously working through a kind of economy of means. One is exploiting the cross-section, first one on your left, where this kind of spatial boundary drifts between an outer perimeter of the house and creating an overhang. So I'll show that in 1 minute. Then this gradient of volumes, which I showed, which has this internal set of consequences spatially. It's not just a kind of graphic on the outside of the project. It also is kind of indexing and expressing an internal volumetric set of differences. There's a part of the project that is a kind of nested object within the house that we call the house within the house. And that is kind of what it sounds like. It is more kind of like closed, wet, and private spaces that are kind of inhabiting like this larger volume. And then finally, composite space. And composite space really means like how you can really actively form productive overlaps between private and public circulation in the design space, and the house can kind of modulate. To start with a more kind of general sense, there are these two overlapping envelopes. This first one is the kind of outer perimeter where the overhang is, and then this kind of inner volume. And I'm interested here in how those two volumes are kind of interacting and kind of pushing up against different edges, so to speak, in those layers. So there's a real interplay that's happening between these two implied volumes, kind of conceptually, that produces this very perimeter that is either set back so there's a kind of overhang condition, which is important. Like you want to be able to shed water, snow, and all that for the majority of this. But then there are these other kind of intimate, kind of cross-grained spaces that are pockets or kind of pop-outs, as we affectionately call them, that house these different intimate areas of the program, some which are more flexible and some which are more fixed. For example, a work/sleep space, and so on. So you can see in the cross section as it kind of goes through these different like, profiles that these different pop-outs exploit the cross section in different ways and offer this kind of range of sectional profiles and spatial experiences. So one thing I want to kind of say to you students out there today is that this is a very constrained project, right? In terms of like its form, its economics. If you search for things in these kind of models that you can exploit, I think you get a lot out of them, right? Like, I mean, I think this section maybe is, I feel like I could have gotten more out of this. So, like, whatever you're working on, no matter how kind of like simple it is, like I think there's a lot there to kind of like work on in terms of design problems. That'd be one of my pieces today to say. And then of course these pop-ups, they have real kind of internal spatial consequences, right? So we're looking kind of into one where there's a window associated with, there's a pantry back in there, it's a storage. But they really kind of extend space in certain ways, and I think they create different forms of intimacy and a intricate forms of programming that are more kind of attuned to that scale. So kind of back to the gradients. So again, there's this kind of graphic coding of the house on the outside that is really a kind of super graphic, these gradients of volumes that happen internally. So there's this one continuous roof, there are these three different kind of volumes, and those are expressed graphically. So it sets up a kind of, I would say, an intentional kind of ambiguity between what is a part, what is a whole, both graphically and like. You can see this GIF is kind of showing you these differences in terms of like the internal volumes, how it kind of breaks down that graphic externally, and middle end. And this is relating one to a kind of subtle topographic change that happens on the site where it had a kind of like subtly sloping shape to it. And then these more general kind of programmatic distinctions. This is the part that we call the house within the house, and the kind of white object in the middle, this thing here, the eyes. And it holds all of the service, wet spaces, bedrooms, and sleeping lofts, and it's really kind of packed in smaller spaces like a ship, and surrounded by this more kind of continuous, larger volume. And what allows for a kind of modification between privacy, let's say smaller spaces, and being kind of open to a larger, more public volume are sliding panels, or kind of like open spaces to allow for more privacy, or to allow for there to be more crossing. And then the entry itself, you'll really see is this kind of thing right here, kind of cuts through that whole volume as well. Sorry, I'm a little crazy with the exterior, but it's mainly for the exhibition. This one is really kind of just showing like how this house within the house is nested and embedded in this larger volume. And then you can see the section here that breaks down into these smaller sets of spaces. That can even break down even further in terms of defining things. That's a kind of general sense. So sometimes in the house within the house, you get a double height space like there, or you get as lots, or you get more kind of like single height spaces down below. So again, kind of like to the students, try to get a lot of mileage. And this is obviously kind of tipping of the hat to a kind of history of faces in architecture, particular architects, one that Gary really likes a lot, Shinohara, and we have kind of affectionately come to call these the eyes of the house, so to speak. So that's a sleeping loft up there that then has this kind of relationship to the public spaces down below. That's what it's like inside. So these sleeping lofts are very kind of like tight and very low, like just over my head in terms of height. And these, they can, in my mind, be much more kind of mountain hut-like in terms of their sharing capacity, or much more kind of like private individuals. So that's a kind of form of a sleeping space that is much less defined. And then the house within the house also has this kind of nested scales of space within it, like this kind of day bed, which kind of dual functions as sit and hang out or dance around on it, like Bali, my nephew's kid, or to kind of, we'll eventually have a way to kind of like privatize that, so that can be a kind of place to sleep. And the entry itself is, as I mentioned, it's kind of lateral cut through the house, within the house, and it cuts through the inside of it, that's kind of defined in the plywood, and then connects the outside to the inside of the home. And the bathrooms and the wet spaces they're more coded in this way as being like a kind of solid that is more like kind of carved layers that reveal these different kind of like layers of this gradient that is obviously referring back to that kind of super graphic on the outside. While at the same time, the material itself is referencing certain kind of environmental conditions. You can see the video where I'm showing like snow, like at night or snow during the day, like it's kind of like purposefully referring to its context. Kind of playful way. And here's a kind of sense of how a simple mechanism like a sliding door can really allow a room to change pretty dramatically, where a room can kind of be much more public, where you can close it off and be much more private, And I'm going to show and plan how there's a kind of extension of that idea across what seems like circulation, but is not the circulation. These are very small rooms, they're about 8.5 feet wide. Then there's this kind of like set of kind of roosts or lofts that are sitting up above wet spaces and access by these ladders. And those are very kind of undefined spaces. So this kind of idea of like a composite of spaces are really designed so that the longhouse has these flexibilities between privacy and shared space, between design space and circulation. You can see it kind of modulating there depending on where you are in the house. And I think this hopefully like creates a continuous, what I call positive kind of ambiguity between functions of space where the house can be more receptive to certain changes or alterations. You can see, kind of get a taste of it here, the pink lines are kind of describing how at one level the volume around the interior object is more of a corridor, and at other times it really is kind of dissolved by spaces that are kind of cutting across it. Which you can see also in this image. So in this image, the kind of bedroom proper might extend all the way across what would normally be a corridor, a hallway into one of these pop-outs. And the pop-outs itself becomes a kind of workspace. So that kind of begins to dissolve these relationships. Or there might be a much more like smooth separation. So to kind of finish up on long-ish house, it can really be thought of as a house, or it can be thought more of as a kind of collective housing project, and that's where I think like this really exists. It's more temporary in nature. You can imagine having 10 people packed in here, right? Instead of living together, but it can do that. There's also a shed associated with the house that kind of like takes some visual cues. And again, I'm showing this to kind of students understand, like even this is an 8-foot by 10-foot shed, quite inexpensive to build, and I think it's working on certain kind of like things architecturally, kind of question form, graphic coding, section cuts. Is it a kind of graphic? Is it more of a form? You decide. I think it becomes quite graphic like on this elevation. Okay, so this is the kind of second section. This is going to, even though it's the longer house, it's going to be a lot quicker and shorter. So Dave and I, nobody wants to eat before we get it. So the build house was really originally designed as a form of a long house, but it couldn't quite get there. I wanted it to actually be longer than it is, to really start to get into that kind of like territory more firmly. At 96 feet, it's kind of just 30 feet. But I also really thought of how this kind of house could become more technological, more of a kind of model that could extend in certain ways, that could become something more than a house, kind of move into the idea and the realm of housing. In this case, looking at the question of the problem of workforce housing around town. So again, this is a speculative project, the one on the bottom, which extends the length of the longish house into 180 feet plus. And this one now becomes something that is based in a kind of idea of affordable, co-living, cooperative housing model for mountain town workforce populations. It's a kind of critique and a response at once that is set in relationship to the more typical kind of like deed restricted workforce housing. Much of it looks like this. There's nothing inherently wrong with it at all, but it's very kind of like dominantly based in certain kind of codes of living, forms of ownership, and it's very in certain ways. It really does not allow for a lot of kind of community interaction and collective space. It tends to be more based in individual ownership. It's geared more towards the kind of mean average, and it definitely lacks these kind of collective spaces that I'm interested in. And it really does not have the flexibility to be both kind of long-term ownership and short-term, more kind of temporary rental bases. So this drawing, which I'll be doing the unpacking, can it's kind of showing like a floor plan, kind of loft level, certain kind of ideas about how relationships work. So it's more of a kind of like conceptual drawing. So I think here it's like, where this project is really kind of building off of the work that I've been doing in the housing studios in second year of the grad program, but also like really trying to kind of establish a relationship to many of the kind of things that are happening around housing right now that you might find in work with Sasha Dells, who teaches here. Just gave a really compelling talk a couple of weeks ago about cooperative forms of housing. So what I would imagine with this longer house is that would accommodate both a cooperative kind of equal ownership model, but also one that is more transient in terms of the forms of living, more kind of nomadic, more kind of geared towards the forms of culture and community that exist in these kinds of mountain towns. So the idea would be that you can either buy into an equal share of ownership, like a cooperative, or you could be much more kind of transient. I think, I know that these mountain communities tend to really defy certain forms of living. That's why people are living in the mountains kind of to begin with. They are often more nomadic, more seasonal, and open to alternative ways of living, kind of living together. So I think there needs to be a kind of model of housing that starts to respond to that and be more aligned with that idea, which I don't really think exists yet. We're starting to see it here in LA, certain forms of co-living, but definitely not out in the kind of landscape of the West. Even though there's probably a real kind of history to that that we forgot. So just kind of quickly to go through this drawing, I'm going to run out of time here. It is kind of bookended by, like, let's say, shared communal space, kitchen, dining, that kind of stuff. There's a kind of workspace in the middle. There are a series of kind of minimal dwelling bedroom units. So this whole floor is really kind of more geared towards somebody who would buy into a kind of cooperative, co-ownership kind of model. And it would be inexpensive because you're all throwing all this money into one thing instead of a bunch of different things, and very kind of cost competitive. It would have to have certain restrictions associated with it to make it kind of viable. But I think it's a totally viable and potential model to promote. Then in this layer of the drawing, it's really kind of talking about this kind of collateral relationship between bedrooms and workspaces and how there's kind of flexibility to that. This layer of the drawing is really speaking to the more temporary or hostel-like or mountain hut-like form of the project, where if you wanted to stay here for a few nights or a night, that there's that kind of like layer of the project. It's more like a kind of loft. And then, of course, we've expanded that idea of series now. So, and then here is my artist's rendition of what the longer house might look like. This is really just kind of quick Photoshop slide of the hand, but you get a sense of that. And then to kind of wrap it up, I'm looking at how the longhouse idea, like when you look at like the kind of pre-modern forms of the longhouse, you see a lot of different forms of organization. Like, it's not always just one longhouse, it's often like longhouses, or how one longhouse relates to another. The Iroquois had these kind of like almost fortified like areas where they had a whole group of longhouses populating field. Here I'm looking, kind of speculating on the idea that this model can start to kind of live together and follow the terrain. It's very kind of like interactive with topography, like a forest pathway in certain ways, a kind of network or village-like. Or you can imagine them a little more kind of discrete and be linked together as a kind of network and take on very distinct kind of architectural identities, more like so that's that. And I'm just going to end here as a kind of epilogue. That's in the slides. And this is really the kind of right side of the monitor. And it's obviously referencing all of these different kind of layers of the context of the mountains, whether they are biological, cultural, atmospheric, kind of food based. So that's more of a kind of art project, let's say, right And on the right there as well, you'll see certain images that are models that I had made, that we had made, that we were trying to kind of test out these ideas inside, using them as a kind of like movies on scene kind of representation. That's it. Thanks for coming, and probably have a couple minutes left. Yes, Francis. How appropriate.
Wonderful presentation. Just a sort of personal question.
Yeah.
I'm so you told us that you're an introvert. And yet
Oh,
you're
yeah.
so interested in the view of living. Would you do it yourself?
It's weird, right? I would, under certain circumstances, let's say. I would have to kind of be reassured that I would have kind of my own types of spaces. Like the kitchens in particular, I think that's an area that really needs to kind of be worked on, you know, collectively, like where you feel like you have a kind of territory and ownership over things that nobody else messes with. So probably things like that I think would be important. Kind of like understanding a really strong kind of set of principles that guide you, let's say. So,
Or differentiated spaces.
Or differentiated
Very long
spaces
one,
as well.
differentiated for different personalities.
yeah, totally. That's another great way to do it. Yeah. It's a really good question. Always to like process it. Yeah. I think all of us are a little inherently nervous about like the collective living. Eric.
On the same line of this, in your beginning research, there was this openness about where it's standard.
Yeah.
And on yours, you almost have some fixed unit that got
Yeah.
created. Did you find that that unit that you developed was kind of a sweet spot in terms of numbers, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this kind of leap, you know, into like how do we kind of satisfy like realism around this project where you can actually produce products and still kind of like open it up to the public. That's the kind of implementation. I think it should be explored as something that's more kind of flexible. And that would probably be more, it would probably just be a different model, I think. Like one where there's more of a sense of like whoever's moving in there's kind of defining it's maybe like kind of a shell warehouse idea. Or maybe some architecture, kind of like infrastructure in which I can then install my own sets of architectural kind of intervention. It's a different model. A sick parent. And then,
I'm hoping that the house is net zero, so once that is
I'm sorry, I didn't
I'm
catch that.
hoping that your house is net zero energy and carbon. What techniques do you use to do that?
Yeah, so the house that I showed,
Yeah,
the
you're.
built one,
Yeah.
solar.
Yeah.
So it's totally off grid. It's heavily insulated. It meets all these kind of like really tight environmental kind of codes that are in mountain county, in certain mountain town counties. In that one, I think it's quite restrictive. So very high R values. It is Class A fire resistant on the outside. That is definitely kind of in potential forest fire area, but it's totally Class A, like every surface on the outside.
I want people to notice that it's a beautiful house,
Thank you.
but it's also a efficient. And they don't have to be utilized.
Totally. Hopefully that message is clear. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
The long house seems like the perfect situation for multi-generational living.
Yeah.
I like to
Yeah.
imagine my grandma with that maybe walking back and forth with all the different conditions. But, you know, the one thing that really stood out to me is the picture of the roof.
Okay.
Why is it so dramatic? When you're at the inside, you're like looking at something.
Yeah, I mean, for one, to shed snow, another to kind of produce the volume inside.
Make it seem like you're more.
Well, there's actually a lot of usable volume in that roof, like when you start to stack over on top of each other in the section. Like
Yeah.
all those kind of
Yeah.
off spaces, those are actually not really happening.
Okay.
So it has to be at a kind of angle where that starts to be somewhat efficient.
Well, it looks in front of that.
Yeah. Yep.
gorgeous project, Hadrian. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And just maybe a note to the students. What a thoughtful and beautiful presentation to be able to work with what we ask our students to do, to work with the precedent and actually lay out what we're doing and then break down the design in these ways and follow through. I thought it was an excellent presentation in that way. The precedent was interesting that you chose the Polynesian longhouse as a way.
Yeah.
I thought it made contrast to the mountain house in a way. It's almost this cute. Whereas you mentioned the Iroquois later, but certainly Native American longhouses or Viking longhouses are maybe closer climatically to this.
That's
type
fair.
of
I can actually have those they're in the exhibition. You'll
Right.
see if
Okay.
you watch the left side, they'll come up. I took him out of this lecture. It's just too many slides, so it's target. This is dumb answers that, Jeff.
Well, it's interesting.
I'm definitely referring to those as well.
Because certain ways with the windows and the glazing, you have that feeling connection, like the Polynesian ones where you have the air movement and stuff underneath the roof, whereas the Viking ones or the Native Americans are more solid in a way.
The Iroquois model is super interesting. It's more kind of like half kind of appreciate like the tectonics of that system. It's really okay. One last question.
I'm interested in this mountain workforce housing idea, but it seems like there's not very much interest in realizing that from ski companies. So what do you think is the path forward to building a
The ski companies now are really becoming massive corporations, right? Private owners, so it's like the ski area happens to be like kind of a side project. Right? So there's not a lot of kind of inherent interest in their staff. Right? It's a problem. So what I'm seeing in some of these ski towns are these different kind of foundations that are being established that can really kind of like get these projects going, like in terms of identifying land, working with different governmental agencies to establish like really phenomenal low interest borrowing of capital, and like kind of like earmarking sites that have to then be within certain kind of like zoning overlays and then establish them as workforce housing. They cannot be anything else. Working on the kind of legal distinctions of deed restrictions so that can really work as a viable model. So there are some real serious developers and foundations starting to work together that are doing it. That are much more kind of outside like ownership of the ski areas itself. It's a bummer, again, in the ski areas that there's not a lot more kind of investment. It's a little bit more. It's weak at best. I think maybe not every single one, but like what I think. So hopefully that kind of ownership model changes as well in the future. It doesn't all become consolidated like everything else is. Yes, it's right on. Okay, I'll let everybody grab some lunch. Thanks again for coming.